Well, having prior relevant knowledge doesn't just help you with comprehension, it also helps you retain new information from what you're reading. It has been said that, and I did not invent this phrase, but I love it, so I use it all the time. Knowledge is like mental Velcro. It sticks best to other related knowledge. So one way to think of this is that some kids are coming in with more of that other half of the Velcro, more academic knowledge and vocabulary, probably because they have more highly educated parents who have better resources. They're probably going to be given access to more complex texts and a leveled reading system, and they are in a better position, they're in a pretty good position to retain new vocabulary, new information from those texts because they have the Velcro for those things to stick to. The other kids, meanwhile, who come in with less of that other half of the Velcro are, first of all, restricted to simpler books. But even if there's some new information in those books, they're probably not going to retain it because they don't have anything to stick to. So what this leads to, the kids with the other half of the Velcro are acquiring more knowledge and vocabulary, and that enables them in turn to read yet more complex text as the grade levels go up. But the other kids fall farther and farther behind.
My name's Glenn Fay. I'm the Director of the Education Program here at the CIS. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here, some for the first time and others very nice to welcome you back to the CIS. Always good to have your company, including early in the morning. Today we're talking about, our topic is Beyond Phonics, Building Knowledge-Rich Literacy. Now, I might be a little bit biased, but I think of all the organisations in Australia, the CIS has done more than just about all of them in advancing policy and practice in literacy over the past few decades. Our 5 from 5 initiative played a critical role in advancing the science of reading across Australia's classrooms, and most importantly, in the introduction of phonics screening checks in most Australian states. Now, though our research on reading has had a focus on phonics and decoding, we know that that's not the whole story when it comes to reading. Reading comprehension depends on what students already know and the words they can draw on. If we stop at how to read and don't teach knowledge worth reading about, we risk producing fluent decoders who can't make meaning from what they read. So today we'll focus on taking it the next mile, building knowledge, vocabulary, and writing right across the curriculum. This is where the science of learning meets a knowledge-rich curriculum, which is something I'm very excited for us to be talking about here, that once was considered a kind of niche topic, but is now one that's very much mainstream in Australian education. So back to today's business, where I'm very pleased to be welcoming to you 3 wonderful speakers that have joined us from different parts of the world and Australia. Natalie Wexler will deliver our keynote today, and then we'll enter a conversation with our 2 other guests. Natalie Wexler is an American education writer, best known for her books The Knowledge Gap and The Writing Revolution. She's also author of Beyond the Science of Reading, Connecting Literacy Instruction to the Science of Learning. After Natalie gives her address, we'll also be joined on stage in conversation by two other guests who have travelled almost as far as Natalie to be here. Lorraine Hammond joins us from Perth. She's Associate Professor in Early Years Literacy at the University of Notre Dame and recognised, I think rightly, as among Australia's best teacher educators. So very good to have your company at CIS again, Lorraine. And we'll also be joined by Erica Stanford, who is New Zealand's Education and Immigration Minister and leading what I believe to be some of the most exciting policy reform work in the English-speaking world. So we're very grateful for your company as well. So without further ado, I'll open the floor over to you, Natalie, to deliver our address this morning.
Thank you, Glenn, for orchestrating a really head-spinning a series of events for me. I think I know where I am this morning, but it's been pretty busy. So beyond phonics. So we'll start with, we have been hearing a lot in the United States, and I assume in Australia as well, about reading. These are just some of the headlines that have appeared in mainstream media in the United States across the spectrum over the last couple of years. And a lot of this coverage has been sparked by the work of an American audio education journalist named Emily Hanford. Her work is fantastic. If you haven't listened to Sold a Story and some of her other audio documentaries, I highly recommend them. And it's great that a spotlight is being trained on some serious problems with the way we've gone about reading instruction. But there's one word that does keep coming up in this coverage: phonics. And sometimes even the science of reading, which is the phrase that you see a lot to refer to science related to reading, is reduced. It's especially in the media to phonics. It's a phonics-centric approach or whatever. And so it's not that science of reading advocates say that reading is just about phonics, but the spotlight has really been on problems with that aspect of reading instruction, and it's given rise to the assumption that if we just fix the phonics problem, we'll be good to go. And I don't mean to minimize the importance of phonics. It is crucial, and many students will never become proficient readers unless they get systematic phonics instruction. But is it enough? So what happens when states in the United States reform, they engage in early literacy reform, which 40-some states have now done, so almost all of them have adopted some policy or enacted some legislation that is designed to fix reading instruction. And they basically all focus on phonics. So things like screening tests. We don't really have a phonics check in the United States, but there are different tests that schools can use. Holding kids back at third grade if they're not decoding well yet. So what happens in these states? And some researchers have looked at that. And what they found was what those states who engage in those policies do get a bump in reading test scores at third grade, at fourth grade, to some extent at fifth grade. But then that bump fades out, and it's like you didn't do it. So what happens, when kids get to sixth grade? Do they just forget how to decode words? Well, no, probably not. The words do get harder to decode. They're more multisyllabic words and do have to pay attention to that. But testing experts agree that what becomes more important to reading proficiency as the grade levels go up, beyond just the ability to decode, is the ability to comprehend the text you're reading. And so this suggests that something is also missing from our approach to reading comprehension. And just to underscore this, the key finding is that these effects fade out by middle school. This is someone with a PhD telling you that, so you don't have to just trust me. So what's been missing? Why are we having this problem? So let's take a quick look at the typical approach to teaching reading comprehension, which has been very widespread in the United States for decades. So reading comprehension is conceived of as a set of strategies and skills. So these are things like finding the main idea of a text, making inferences, comparing and contrasting. This is just one list I found online. And generally, there is a skill of the week. And the teacher will briefly model the skill using a text chosen not for what it's about, but for how well it lends itself to demonstrating whatever the skill is, comparing, contrasting, whatever. And then the other part of this approach has the children go off to practice whatever the skill is on a book or a text that has been determined to be at their individual reading level. And again, these books are not categorized by topic. They're on random topics that kids may or may not know anything about. And their individual reading level could be years below their grade level. But the idea is that if they diligently practice a skill like finding the main idea of a text, they will master that skill and they'll be able to apply it to read and understand and find the main idea of any text that they try to read, whether it's a textbook down the road in high school or a newspaper article. If you're good at finding the main idea, you'll be able to find the main idea. So we're just going to briefly try that out, test that theory. I'm going to just show you a paragraph taken from a newspaper and ask you to find the main idea. And I'm sure you're all proficient readers, so this shouldn't be a challenge. So I'll give you a minute to read the paragraph. So what I didn't tell you is I took this paragraph from an American newspaper. And when I do this in the United States, I use a paragraph from a British newspaper about a cricket match and I get equally blank looks. So if you were a baseball fan, you would probably have no trouble understanding this paragraph. If you don't know anything about baseball, and even though I'm American, I don't know anything about baseball, so I can't understand this paragraph. You can decode these words, sure, but they don't add up to anything meaningful. So this is something that cognitive scientists who study reading comprehension have known about for a long time now. Back in the late 1980s, a couple of researchers asked, what is more important to reading comprehension? Is it these general skills, supposedly general skills like finding the main idea, the kinds of skills that appear to be measured by standardized reading comprehension tests? Or is it how much the reader knows about the topic? And they chose the topic of baseball. So this has come to be known as the baseball study, maybe for obvious reasons after you tried reading that paragraph. But they figured there were probably a lot of kids out there. They were doing this with 12 and 13-year-olds. Probably a lot of kids out there who are not generally good readers, but they do know a lot about baseball. So they took this bunch of kids and they divided them into 4 groups, depending on how well they had scored on a standardized reading comprehension test and how much they knew about baseball. And then they gave them all a passage to read describing part of a baseball game and tested their comprehension of that baseball passage. And what they found was what really made the difference was how much a kid knew about baseball. So this green bar, those are the poor comprehenders, according to the test, who were baseball experts. And this significantly lower blue bar, those are the good comprehenders, according to the test, who didn't know much about baseball. So as you can see, when the poor comprehenders were reading about a topic they knew a lot about, there was actually no problem with their comprehension. This is not just one study. There have been, I think, 19 studies on the topic of baseball alone, but also other areas, and the same findings have always come up. And what these studies tell us is, first of all, something like finding the main idea of a text. It's not a skill like riding a bike where it doesn't matter what bike you're riding. It's not a skill like decoding words where you could transfer that skill. Whether you can apply a skill like finding the main idea of a text depends to a large extent on whether you have enough relevant background knowledge to make sense of the text, at least at a superficial level. And along with that, there's really no such thing as a fixed reading level, which we rely on a lot in the United States, whether individual or grade, because those measures don't take account of the reader's knowledge and what the topic is. They are based on things like how long the sentences are, how commonly used are the vocabulary words. So this is something that reading comprehension instruction has really overlooked. Now, that may be obvious when we're talking about a topic with its own lingo, like baseball or cricket or molecular biology. What may be less, if you know the lingo, obviously it's going to be easier to understand a text on that topic. What may be less obvious is how much we rely on our general knowledge of the world to understand pretty much everything we read. And that is particularly true of more academic kinds of knowledge and vocabulary, because especially as texts become more complex as we go up the grade levels, that's the kind of knowledge that is increasingly assumed. Writers don't explain every term they use. If they did, no one would want to read their writing. It would be very tedious. So it has been found as a result that there's a very strong correlation between knowing something like what mythical Greek hero demonstrated his bravery during his long journey homeward from the Trojan War and general reading comprehension. So the more stuff like that you know, or in what part of the body does pneumonia occur, the more stuff like that you know, the better your chances of understanding pretty much anything you try to read. And what that suggests is that instead of having kids practice these supposedly abstract skills that are in fact really non-transferable skills over and over again, year after year, what we really should be doing if we want to boost their reading comprehension is giving them access to as much academic knowledge and vocabulary as possible. That's really going to help with reading comprehension. But that's not all, because reading comprehension is really complicated. It is much more complicated than the decoding side of reading. And so in addition to, we know knowledge of the topic is going to be helpful to comprehension. We know general, especially academic knowledge will be helpful. There is also familiarity with complex syntax or sentence structure. Because the sentence structure of written language is almost always more complex than the kind of sentence structure we use in conversation. And so even if a kid is a good decoder, even if maybe he or she has a good vocabulary, if they're not familiar with the kind of complex sentence structure that appears in written language, things like subordinating conjunctions, etc., there may be a big barrier to their comprehension. So, for example, I came across a study of a 10-year-old boy who had average decoding ability, but he struggled with comprehension. And the researcher in this study read the boy this sentence: Rachel Carson, a scientist, writer, and ecologist, grew up in the rural river town of Springdale, Pennsylvania. And then she asked him, "What do you know about Rachel Carson now?" And he replied, they grew up together in the same place. Now, how would he get that answer? Well, it has to do with syntax, with sentence structure. So this structure here, that's called an appositive, a phrase describing a noun. You see this a lot in written text, but we don't talk this way. So this boy, being unfamiliar with this sentence structure, thought there were 4 different people in this sentence and they all grew up together. And that's really not uncommon. It's not uncommon for a kid to seize on the noun closest to the verb in a sentence and think that noun goes with the verb, when in fact there may be a lot of other words in between. So just to illustrate, this is not, a rare kind of occurrence. I came across another study, a long-term, large-scale study, finding that in the United States, fewer than 10% of 8th graders can evaluate complex syntax. So this is another barrier to comprehension that's not being addressed by the typical approach, because we limit kids to books they can at least theoretically read on their own. And what that means is those books are likely to have pretty simple syntax as well as simple vocabulary. So kids never get the exposure to the more complex syntax and vocabulary that can enable them to move up to read and understand more complex text. Now, that general knowledge of academic knowledge, general familiarity with complex syntax is the goal, because it's that general knowledge that will equip students to read texts on top and understand texts on topics they don't already know about. But how do we accomplish that goal? How do we get that general knowledge into kids' heads? Really, the only way is through knowledge of lots of topics, because the vocabulary, the rules of syntax don't stick in the abstract. They need a meaningful context in order to stick in long-term memory. So it's through knowledge of lots of topics. So I'm a little intimidated, because I'm going to give you a very quick and dirty explanation of cognitive load theory, and the father of cognitive load theory is sitting in the audience. So John, correct me if I miss anything important, but and this, as I said, this is a very bare bones explanation, but it explains the importance of prior knowledge to comprehension, to analysis, to anything, pretty much, any higher order thinking. So the crucial box here, I would say, you take information in. This is a diagram of basically how we take in new information, how we learn. And this box, working memory, is crucial because it's the aspect of our consciousness we're taking in new information, trying to make sense of it, and it's very limited in its capacity. On average, it can hold maybe 4 or 5 items of new information for about 20 seconds before it starts to become overwhelmed and we start to lose our ability to understand or retain the information. The best way around those limitations on working memory is long-term memory, because if we can retrieve items of information that we already have stored in long-term memory and that we know, then when we need them, we don't have to juggle those things in working memory, and that expands the capacity of working memory to take in new information, to learn. So if you're reading about baseball, for example, and you already know what a double play is, you don't have to think about that. You don't have to break off reading and go Google it or look it up, which is a tremendous burden on working memory. You can just attend to whatever new information is in the text you're reading. So that burden on working memory is known as cognitive load. And there are, though, a couple of tricks here. And one is we first need to transfer the new information to long-term memory, and we also need to be able to retrieve it when we need it. So what helps with transfer is to attach meaning to the new information. One good way to do that is to explain the information to someone else in your own words. For retrieval, what helps is practice. The more you practice retrieving an item of information, the more likely you are to be able to get it when you need it in the future. And there are different ways to engage in retrieval practice. Quizzes is a good way. But again, one good way is to explain the information to someone else in your own words. So we'll come back shortly to those concepts. But that's the basic cognitive architecture that it explains the incredible value of prior knowledge stored in long-term memory. So this approach to literacy, which has overlooked the role of prior knowledge in comprehension, it can have a negative impact on, even if you're a good reader, it can get pretty boring to practice finding the main idea year after year on a bunch of random topics, which is what happens in a lot of schools. But it has its most negative impact on certain groups of students. So the students who struggle with decoding, the ones who are coming in with less academic knowledge and vocabulary, and of course, many students fall into both of these groups, especially at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. They're going to be restricted to these simple books that they at least theoretically can read on their own. They're not going to get access to the very thing that could help them move up, which is more academic knowledge and vocabulary. And the situation only gets worse as the years go by. So why is that? Well, having prior relevant knowledge doesn't just help you with comprehension. It also helps you retain new information from what you're reading. It has been said that, and I did not invent this phrase, but I love it, so I use it all the time. Knowledge is like mental Velcro. It sticks best to other related knowledge. So one way to think of this is that some kids are coming in with more of that other half of the Velcro, more academic knowledge and vocabulary, probably because they have more highly educated parents who have better resources. They're probably going to be given access to more complex texts and a leveled reading system, and they are in a better position, they're in a pretty good position to retain new vocabulary, new information from those texts because they have the Velcro for those things to stick to. The other kids, meanwhile, who come in with less of that other half of the Velcro are, first of all, restricted to simpler books. But even if there's some new information in those books, they're probably not going to retain it because they don't have anything to stick to. So what this leads to, the kids with the other half of the Velcro are acquiring more knowledge and vocabulary, and that enables them in turn to read yet more complex text as the grade levels go up. But the other kids fall farther and farther behind. This has led to something that's been described as the Matthew effect in reading. That's a reference to the Gospel of Matthew and the part that basically says the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And so by the time kids get to high school, the gap between these two groups of readers can be very wide indeed and very difficult to narrow, which is why it's so important to begin building knowledge and vocabulary for all children beginning in the early grades, beginning in kindergarten. One problem, though, in those early grades is that it can look like that skills and strategies approach to comprehension is working. It can look like they're getting better at finding the main idea or whatever, but that's basically because most of the texts we ask them to read at those low grade levels don't assume a whole lot of academic knowledge and vocabulary. And then when they get to higher grade levels and the texts do start assuming that kind of knowledge and vocabulary, they hit a wall if they don't have it. And it can be very hard to supply all the knowledge they need when they're 16, 17 years old. So I wrote this book, The Knowledge Gap, before the pandemic, and I was concerned about this situation then. I'm even more concerned now because we had a lot of remote and hybrid schooling in the United States during the pandemic, and the kids who were not being well served by the system before the pandemic bore the worst negative impact from remote and hybrid learning. We can't just go back to what we were doing before the pandemic and do more of it, which is what a lot of people are advocating because it wasn't working before the pandemic. Test scores were dropping. The gap between the high and low scorers was widening before the pandemic. The pandemic just made it worse. And so I didn't write the book just to describe the problem. I also wanted to know what we can do about it. And I co-authored this book on writing instruction. And that's the book that came out earlier this year, Beyond the Science of Reading. And so in these books, what I'm trying to do is identify the causes of the problem and also suggest solutions. So what can we do? Well, one crucial thing is to give children access to a knowledge-building curriculum that starts building their knowledge, vocabulary, and familiarity with complex syntax at an early age. And by the way, when we say curriculum, we mean something in the United States, we mean something different from what you mean by curriculum here. We mean more like curriculum resources, so scope and sequence and detailed lesson plans and what text you're going to use and what class discussion questions are you going to ask. That is provided to teachers. Not that they always use it, but it's there. And there have been in the United States a number of knowledge-building literacy curricula at the elementary level and sometimes middle school level developed in recent years. And these curricula, they cover different bodies of knowledge in different ways. We do not have a national curriculum or even national standards, but each state has their own standards. And so what we need are curricula, whether it's called literacy curricula or something else, that go deeply into topics in social studies, science, the arts, including literature. So these curricula that we have, they cover different bodies of knowledge in different ways, but they all have a few things in common. They're organized by topic rather than skill of the week. They spend at least 2 or 3 weeks on a topic, giving kids the repeated exposure to the same concepts that they need for those things to stick in long-term memory. And they have kids reading and writing about the same topics they've been listening to and discussing during class discussion. So I'd just like to talk for a few minutes about explicit writing instruction, because that doesn't get discussed very much, and I really think it could hold the key to improving outcomes for a lot of students. Explicit writing instruction, if you've got a content-rich curriculum and you embed manageable writing instruction in the content of that curriculum, it can provide all the advantages of a cognitive science-informed education. So what it can provide is both transfer and retrieval practice, because remember, for both of those things, what really helps is to explain the information to someone else in your own words. And that is what we do when we write. Opportunities for what cognitive scientists call elaboration. So asking and answering questions like how and why. Can you give an example? That has been found to boost both retention of information and also to deepen comprehension. And that's what we ideally should be doing when we write as well. Development of analytical abilities. When you write, you need to connect different bits of information, figure out what's important, what relates to what. Familiarity with complex syntax. If you learn how to create an appositive or how to use a subordinating conjunction in a sentence, you're in a much better position to understand that kind of sentence structure when you encounter it in your reading, because it's a very powerful way to familiarize students with that. And writing instruction can do all of these things, even if students have never heard of cognitive science, if they've never heard of retrieval practice or whatever, elaboration. Ideally, they do know about those things, but I've encountered many teachers who didn't know about those things and were amazed by what they were seeing in their students, the changes they were seeing in their students. And then sometimes they got interested in cognitive science because they wanted an explanation for what they were seeing. And it can have these dramatic effects on learning even at higher grade levels. But there's a big caveat here, which is that writing is really hard. It's much harder than reading. And so just asking kids to write about what they're learning doesn't always work. In fact, we have evidence that it can interfere with learning because they're so cognitively overloaded by the task of writing itself that students don't have the cognitive capacity to understand and retain the information they're writing about. But if students do get a manageable approach to writing instruction that begins at the sentence level, it can work wonders. But essentially what we need is, instead of seeing these things as separate, reading over here, writing over there, the content areas like social studies and science over at the bottom, and in the United States, they rarely get very much attention at the elementary level. We need to see, first of all, reading and writing as complementary aspects of literacy, and have kids, we know if they write about what they're reading, it's going to boost their comprehension. And more fundamentally, we need to see both of those things as subsets of learning, because everything, once we get past foundational skills, everything we are able to comprehend when we read, everything we're able to produce when we write, draws on everything we've been able to learn. And they are in their own way, at the same time, ways of learning. So it's all connected. And I'd just like to end with a story of one student. When kids get to the high school level, the problem isn't so much lack of content in the curriculum usually. It's that there's content, but they don't have the knowledge and skills to access that content at the level that's expected. And Danny was one of those many students. He was a 9th grader at a very low-performing high school in New York City, where this was a pretty typical writing sample. So this was a prompt given him at the beginning of his 9th grade year. Explain why we study the past. And he wrote, we study the past because it's good to learn about things that happened years ago. In history, we learn all about the past. We learn about wars that happened years ago, how many people died, generals, what countries were in them. Danny was not a special needs student. He was not an English language learner. This is pretty typical. And this school realized they needed help with writing instruction. So they found a woman named Judith Hochman, who is my co-author on that book, The Writing Revolution. And she had developed a method of writing instruction that was very explicit and embedded in the content of the curriculum. So over the course of his 9th grade year, Danny learned, first of all, what is a sentence as opposed to a sentence fragment? How do you construct sentences using appositives, subordinating conjunctions, all sorts of things, and also how to outline paragraphs and essays. And later that same year, in the spring of his 9th grade year, he was able to outline an argumentative essay on the topic of the conquest of the Americas. And his thesis statement, I don't know if you could read it, says, while some view the conquest of the Americas as a positive event, without question, it had a negative impact. And he's able to turn this into a finished argumentative essay. So obviously, this kind of writing instruction can produce dramatic changes in student achievement. But beyond that, important as it is, I'd just like you to imagine what it felt like for Danny to be able to go from that beginning of the year writing sample to being able to create an essay like this, and what that does for a person's self-concept, self-esteem, for what they think they can accomplish in life, and what they feel they deserve from life. So education, content-rich curriculum, plus explicit writing instruction, it can actually change lives. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Natalie. I'm going to maybe just to piggyback off that just a little bit to ask. Now, I think we all thought that was eminently sensible and made sense to all of us. And yet what you're talking about is sort of controversial still in education. Why is that?
That's a big question. Well, I think the controversial part is the idea of knowledge-building curriculum. I mean, you even find professors at schools of education. I was told by one dean of a school of education in the United States that he thought the concept of transmitting knowledge itself was problematic, that it was patriarchal and elitist. And maybe not all teachers would describe it that way, but I think as part of their training, they are imbued with this idea that it is best for children to learn on their own as much as possible through inquiry, discovery. Teachers should not be the sage on the stage, but rather the guide on the side. And so that's one problem. I mean, in order to transmit knowledge, well, first of all, you have to acknowledge that that's a good thing to transmit knowledge. And you also need to be able to see that the teacher actually knows more than the students. And it actually makes sense for the teacher to teach something to the students. And then beyond that, we've had some political battles over whose knowledge in the United States, I think more than you've had in Australia. And some people feel that even though compared to what I got when I was in school many years ago, these curricula are very diverse and not Eurocentric. They are perceived sometimes as being Eurocentric and a white supremacist narrative. So that's one set of problems. I think there's been less opposition to the idea of writing instruction because teachers have not gotten good training in writing instruction. It's very clear to them, as opposed to reading where, kids could be reading, you don't know whether they're understanding it or not. But when they're writing, it's very clear whether they can write or not. And so there's been more receptivity to the writing revolution and some other explicit methods of writing instruction. But those methods are not going to work unless you have a content-rich curriculum, because if you're just jumping from skill to skill, not really going deeply into any one topic, kids probably aren't going to have enough information about a topic to write coherently about it. So I kind of see the writing instruction thing as a wedge. If teachers realize that, I didn't provide enough information for these kids to write anything, they may realize that they actually need to teach something.
I might go, Lorraine. Lorraine, the sort of stuff we're talking about here hasn't always made you as popular as you could be, I might argue. We all love Lorraine here, but I know that there are some people that not always made your life easy. Why is this?
It's been challenging. I mean, I started off as a secondary English teacher teaching in a part of Western Australia where most of the students couldn't read, and that was really confronting. And it didn't dawn on me until much later as to why that was the case. But anyway, I went back to uni and studied and was very fortunate to have a psychologist as my PhD supervisor for my master's and my PhD. I had to go overseas for the first qualification because there was nothing available at the time. Again, that didn't dawn on me as to the relevance of it given where we are now. And then, of course, I began working as an advisor in schools, and then I began working at a university and began to see that teachers, when I provided professional learning, which is something I've tried to do throughout my career through various organisations, some of my colleagues are involved in them, are in the room today, which is great, not-for-profits. And so teachers were very keen to change. Teachers are altruistic, sometimes they just don't have the right tools, they don't know. And so, I started to work with them and they really wanted to change. And then I started working with schools and principals and they were willing to change as well. And systems, got involved with systems as well, and they were happy to change. But the one group that weren't happy to change were the initial teacher educators. And that's where it's really challenging. And I have met colleagues who've said, over my dead body, and I've said, well, if that's what it takes, because unfortunately, I have been unkindly, and I mean it in the kindest possible way, but there's a variety of projects I've been involved with where the removal of one person changed the whole project because we are so heavily invested in ideology, not in science and research. And people find it very hard, I think, to leave their ideology at the door and look at what the research says. So, yes, Glenn, that has, I guess, made me some friends, but made it quite challenging at times because people hang on to those beliefs so strongly.
Minister, you've undertaken some significant reforms, and we'll talk to some of those in some detail in a minute, but to this issue of what's a conventional wisdom within the sector, were you surprised coming in and introducing policy in this area that some of the stuff that we're just talking about is still not always accepted and welcomed in the sector?
It is surprising, but as Lorraine said, teachers want to do the right thing. And when they see the evidence and when they see children accelerating in their reading or their maths, whatever it is, they will want to do that thing. They want to do the right thing. And you're right, it is initial teacher education that's a problem. But as a politician, I also have to educate the public. And it's why in your speech you talked about why we always talk about phonics. And the reason we do that is because people understand phonics. They understand cat, right? It's much, much harder to educate the public on why we need a knowledge-rich curriculum, because knowledge sticks to knowledge and prior knowledge, and being able to comprehend and have those higher order skills, you need knowledge. And that's a much more difficult concept to, as a politician, to educate the public about. And I'm in the eye of that storm at the moment. We've just released our knowledge-rich curriculum. And I've got those people saying to me, and even teachers and educators and everybody saying, you could just Google it. Why are we teaching kids this stuff? They don't need to know that. We've got a new world. We've got AI. And so that's why it's so great being here with you, listening to you again, because I need this transferred into my head, and then I need to work out how to distill it to the public to explain this is why we need a knowledge-rich curriculum, because structured literacy is so much more than phonics. But look, it is confronting that so many people in the sector are still holding on to this child-centred, project-based inquiry. Higher order skills can just be taught in isolation thing, and it is very real. But it's our job as politicians to distill that to the public and talk to parents to make sure that they understand why we're doing what we're doing.
Can I invite you to, Minister, to unpack a little bit the structured literacy, what this is all about, how we know it's working, what are the elements of this, what is it that you're really leading over there?
Well, we are trying to have it is a huge reform, and it is all around the science of learning, and we're trying to break it down into small digestible parts. And we started with structured literacy because it embodies all of the things that we need to do across every subject in the entire curriculum, the entire education system. But if we just break it down and we did structured literacy first, it is all of the things. So our reading scores were terrible. We were still teaching children to guess the word and look at the picture, and we are the home of that. I think we created it almost. It's terrible. But we've been doubling down on it ever since. For decades and decades, we just need to do more of it and making excuses. It's poverty. It's not the way we're teaching kids to read. But through all of the cognitive science and research and all of the amazing experts, we have said to the sector, right, we are going back to, nice and easy, we're going back to phonics and structured literacy. And we have mandated it in every single classroom. We've trained 80% of it now and counting of our primary school teachers. But it's more than structured literacy. We are teaching them about cognitive science, cognitive load theory. We're teaching them about explicit teaching. We're teaching them about the importance of knowledge, all wrapped up in structured literacy. So it's kind of the vehicle to get into everything else. And so when you look at our 6 priorities, a knowledge-rich curriculum, evidence-based instruction, learning support, providing resources and training to our teachers, assessment and data, all of those things, if you look at literacy, right, structured literacy is embedded in the curriculum. We're assessing it through the phonics check. We're training our teachers in structured literacy and giving them resources. It's mandated. We're providing additional support for those who fall behind in reading. all of those things together. And that's why structured literacy is going well, because we're starting to see our phonics check data improve. But all we do now is take that exact same model over here in mathematics, and we do the same thing. And then we'll do it for science, and we'll do it for everything. So it's kind of the way in, and it's worked very well. And our literacy scores just this year, it's only been mandated this year, structured literacy in every school. In term 1, 36% of children met their level in phonics, the screening test. By term 3, it was 58%. So different kids, we measure them when they hit their 20-week mark. We don't have cohort entry. It's terrible. We need to have it, but it's a problem for another day. When they literally start on their 5th birthday, so it makes it difficult. But we assess them, We assess them at knowledge-rich curriculum and structured literacy, terrible for cohort entry, but we assess them when they hit 20 weeks. And so these are different children hitting their 20-week mark. So the teachers are getting more confident, students are spending more time doing structured literacy, and results are taking off. But importantly, those children who need additional support went from 55% to 33% in 3 terms. So massive.
Very good, and congratulations for everything that you're doing. Coming to questions in a second, and just as we do that, whilst you get your questions ready, I want to ask our other panelists a little bit about some of the good signs, some of the things that are happening and pointing in the right direction. First, Natalie, and then to Lorraine. So things that what are the good things happening in this area?
Well, there are. America's a big country. Sometimes it seems like there are a lot of good things happening. I have to just, it's a big country, so it's not happening everywhere, but. There are some states that have really taken the lead on this, a few, and Louisiana is probably the one that has been most successful. They had a visionary superintendent who really understood all this stuff, who was there for 8 years, so he's the top education official in the state, and he really brought educators along, educating the educators about all of this, the why. That state also they had teachers involved in identifying high-quality curricula. They made it then easier for very decentralized, so every school district gets to choose their own curriculum. The state does not dictate what curriculum, but they made it easier to get the curriculum that was rated highly, and they also created their own knowledge-rich curriculum, elementary literacy curriculum. So they got pretty much 85-90% of the schools in the state using truly high-quality literacy curriculum, and they also combined it with some of these strategies and activities from the writing revolution embedded in the curriculum that's available for free to any school in the state. And I've visited a district down there that actually pioneered the writing activities being adapted to the Louisiana curriculum. A very high poverty district, 80% economically disadvantaged, 80% Black. And I saw some truly amazing things happening there. And the teachers, and this is what I mean when I say teachers don't have to be experts in cognitive science in order to accomplish amazing things. Those teachers had never heard of retrieval practice or any of this. But they said, more than one said to me, once we started, we just wanted to teach our kids to write. But once we started doing it, something amazing, something unexpected happened. We realized that teaching them to write clearly was teaching them to think clearly.
I think that I've been very fortunate in some of the projects that I've been involved with. And as Natalie, as you were saying, I work in the Kimberley of Western Australia, 24 schools, social disadvantage at levels that people don't understand. I was there last week. I had to cover up my arms because I've got midgie bites all over the place coming out of Halls Creek. I'm going to a school like Halls Creek and I'm seeing kids who are learning how to read, which previously wasn't happening because the belief system at the time was that these young kids needed something different, clearly. Well, they didn't. They needed exactly the same as everybody else, just more of it and more of the same. So, the learnings from the Kimberley then were one of the reasons behind Canberra-Goulburn. And the take-up in Canberra-Goulburn with their explicit instruction and change to the way they taught literacy was phenomenal and very fast because the kids came to school every day, and they didn't have the social disadvantage issues that we have within the Kimberley. And then from that, there's been this grassroots spread across Australia, and I acknowledge Annie Fogarty in the work that we've done together, many years ago. Hey, let's do something in the school holidays. That'll never work. No, it did. And, my colleague, distinguished Professor Pam Snow, who's hiding down the back, the work that she's done at La Trobe is significant as well. And Renee's here from AIS. They were one of the first groups in Australia to actually take up explicit instruction before anybody else was terribly interested. So I will say that it's good people who will champion something that works. As we said, teachers are altruistic. They want the best for their students. Less people say to me these days, oh, but that won't work here, because it will. There's case studies of everything. You want, second language learners, yes, low SEI, high SEI. It works in every context because we all have the same brain. We all learn the same way. It's just a case of kind of getting on with it.
Very good. We'll just come to the floor now. There will be a roving mic. Yeah, please.
Thanks so much for your speech and also the panel. I just have a question about the writing revolution. What are the common misconceptions that you've come across in the way people interpret the writing revolution and putting it into schools? Because often things like this, as they become popular, they grow in misconceptions. So I'm interested in whether you can kind of forewarn us about that.
Yeah, I mean, it is trickier. It's a trickier method of instruction than it might at first appear. And so one misconception is that it's all about sentence level activities. In fact, the outlining, teaching kids how to create clear linear outlines for paragraphs and essays are equally important, because even if you're good at constructing sentences, writing at length imposes its own heavy cognitive load. You have to think, well, what was I going to say next? Did I already say that? And if you can offload that to a clear linear outline, then that's a big help. I'd say the other misconception may be that you have to go through all of the sentence level activities before you can let students write paragraphs and essays, and that's not true. They need to have some sentence level concepts under their belt before they go on to. First, they should learn how to outline a paragraph. I'd say that one thing, and it is tricky. It's not a curriculum, so it doesn't have its own content, and it doesn't come with ready-made activities. Teachers need to adapt the activities in the writing revolution to whatever content they're teaching it, and it's designed to be used in any subject area at any grade level. And that's been a heavy burden sometimes on teachers. It can be tricky to create those activities. But the Writing Revolution organization, which provides teacher training online, has recently developed an AI-powered tool called Ask Judy. That's Judy Hockman. And teachers can use it to say, they could say, for example, I'm teaching about ancient India and I need a because but so activity, or I need a sentence expansion activity, and the Ask a Judy will provide it. So it seems to work really well, and I think that will help address a lot of the misconceptions that are out there about how to use these activities.
Can I just maybe a little follow up there that maybe people who not huge fan, maybe people that are not huge fans of the writing revolution might say that that the kind of structured, ordered way in which like the sample you showed before, this just creates formulaic writing and people writing to formula. How do you respond to that?
Well, the way Judy Hockman responds to it is, yeah, it's a formula. That's what they need. She said, if you're a beginning cook, you need a recipe. And then once you get more experience, you can depart from the recipe. But yes, I mean, another misconception is that this is going to stifle creativity and the development of their writerly voices. But the thing is, if writing is so hard, many of these students, they cannot get anything coherent out, and it's a great relief to them to have a formula that provides them with a structure they can follow. And then, sure, do they always need to write a concluding sentence for every paragraph? No. Once they've gone on to writing essays, they don't need to do that. But it has laid the groundwork for writing a concluding paragraph to an essay. So, teachers to some extent, but especially students, once they've learned the formula and they're comfortable with the formula, of course they can depart from it. But the formula in the beginning is hugely helpful.
James.
Thank you, and thanks to the panel. Is there an argument that far from search and AI making knowledge superfluous, they actually make its acquisition more urgent, because passive users of AI and search will become the serfs of the future?
Can I get Lorraine, that very small question?
Natalie's here.
I can't let Natalie take everything. She's got to take a breath at some point.
I'll give Natalie a chance to take a breath. Look, AI is great. I use AI and I like AI. I can use AI because I know what the answer is. So if I go online and I want to do something and I go, no, that's not right, it will be a good prompt for me. but it's only because I know the correct answer and the right information. And, any of my colleagues in the room who work in universities, we know at the moment that, AI is churning out some essays right now that aren't always quite right, that throw up non-existent references and all sorts of other things. So, buyer beware.
Can I get Natalie weigh in as well, but then Minister as well, just some thinking maybe at your end about how do we address this sort of AI being the disruptor of education potentially of our time? How do we best respond to that, Natalie?
Well, I am concerned about the use of AI by students. I mean, I think it can be helpful for teachers, like this Ask Judy tool that I just described. But the problem with when you are learning, it's very tempting to use AI to do the writing for you, summarize a text for you. But what that overlooks is that in the process of writing, in the process of reading a text and getting the main idea, summarizing, that is part of learning. So if you're letting a ChatGPT do it for you, you're cheating yourself of learning. And I think some students, from what I've read, they understand that at a gut level, but it's as human beings, we just take the path of least resistance. So it's very hard for them not to resort to AI, or they may say, well, it'll just give me a draft and I'll tweak it, but they're still missing out on learning. And I think what we really need policies that apply across the board. And I've talked to university professors who say there's no policy, and it puts the students in a very difficult position. Even if they suspect that using AI is not the best thing for their education, they know that many of their classmates will be turning in AI-generated essays that may get higher grades than theirs if theirs are not as polished. So I think we really need to put some guardrails as soon as possible on students' use of AI.
On the matter of guardrails.
Yes, as a policymaker, we are, look, all of my counterparts when I speak to about AI are as equally as sort of confused as I am and not where we need to be. And I know that New Zealand certainly has a long way to go, but I feel better in the fact that my counterparts are in the same boat because it's moving so quickly. But you're right, we do need to put guardrails in place. And the way that I see AI is as a tool. Children need prior knowledge, and you'll all know when you've used AI, it's so much better when you give it lots and lots and lots and lots of prompts because you have prior knowledge. And so using it, for example, when you're young as a teaching tool is terrible. But having lots of prior knowledge through a knowledge-rich curriculum that's explicitly taught, and then using it later as a tool that you can give prompts to, that children can use it as a tool and put that prior knowledge in and say, I want to write a book, and here is the information that I need, and I want this child to look like this, and I want this child to have the family problem or whatever it is in the book, and then it gets resolved. Having that prior knowledge and using it as a tool, it potentially is a way that we will need to look at this, but that doesn't detract from having enormous prior knowledge that is explicitly taught and that can be thought critically about. But it is a huge, very quickly moving beast, and nobody, hardly anyone has that I've seen has managed to get good policies in place, especially in education.
Can I return to the floor for Andrew?
Are there any particular types of prior knowledge that you actually have to focus on? I mean, for example, you could learn a lot about history. I could tell you a lot about gardening or, soil engineering or some technical subject. What sort of, where do you start? Is it should every kid be doing history lessons or geography lessons before they do technical lessons? Knowledge is very varied, I guess is the point I'm making, and which has greatest impact?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, schools obviously can't teach everything that kids are going to know need to know in the future. And if you try to do that, you'll end up with a very superficial education. So I think to some extent, the choices are going to be arbitrary. There's no list of these are the things that every child needs to learn in school. But I think that there's wider agreement, certainly in the United States, than appears on teaching certain things that kids, there's broad agreement that, yes, kids do need to know about the American Civil War. They do need to know about slavery. And what people are worried about is how it will be taught, about indoctrination. But we've done a terrible job of teaching history in the United States. I mean, there's enormous lack of knowledge. I won't say ignorance. And that's largely because we don't teach it at the elementary level, and sometimes they're not even at the middle school level. And so when kids get to high school, they're expected to, deliver a presentation on whether the elementary school should retain the name Thomas Jefferson. And I'm not kidding; they don't know who Thomas Jefferson was. So how can they? That's an actual anecdote. So I do think we need to, as a society, make certain value judgments about what the basics are that kids need to learn in school, not covering everything, what they need to make sense of the world. And I think, I'm a former historian, so I think history has a lot to do with that. But I think the important thing is to recognize you're not going to teach them everything they need to know. You're not going to be able to teach them just abstract thinking skills. What you can do is provide them with that critical mass of general academic knowledge and vocabulary that enables them to keep learning. So I had I'm old enough that I had an extremely Eurocentric education, but because I had that critical mass of general knowledge and vocabulary, I've been able to educate myself about a lot of things that I never learned in school. And I think that's what we need to strive for.
Can I, just before we leave that topic, invite the Minister, having worked on knowledge-rich curriculum and such, how do we determine which knowledge, whose knowledge, these sorts of things? How do we actually do this? Is it ultimately a political decision? And Lorraine, maybe to talk a little bit to particular kind of knowledge of like where words come from, and in terms of building competent readers.
It's really important that we don't turn this into a political decision. So we are relatively arm's length from the curriculum writing and the topics that are going in, because you're right, there's a million things you can teach. There's no end of knowing of knowledge that you can know. And so you do have to make calls on things. And it is really important for us as legislators and policymakers to stay out of the conversation about what we're teaching as much as we can, because you end up in a terrible spiral. And we've already got an overlay in New Zealand of a cultural argument going on about whose knowledge, and we've got our Indigenous population, the Māori people who had knowledge, and so, but trying to stay away from that and having a balance in the curriculum of Māori knowledge and other knowledge is important, but staying out of that as a politician is very important, because you quickly get caught up in that whose knowledge, what knowledge is. And you don't want to be there. You just want to be talking about, look at all this amazing knowledge that children are going to get. And what was important for us in the curriculum, when you look at it, it's quite clever. We will talk about ancient civilizations. We're talking about the Greeks and the Romans, and we've also got civics in our social sciences curriculum, as well as financial literacy. And you can see this strand all the way through. What were they trading? Did they have coins? Did they not have coins? Were they trading something? What was the value of that? And then we talk about New Zealand. Before we had money, we were trading in greenstone and muskets and other bits and pieces. And then also, what was their form of democracy? And that leads into, talking about democratic institutions. And so we're trying to merge all these bits together. But in the end, we're talking about the kings and queens. We could talk about different eras. It doesn't really matter, but it's making those connections and understanding the world around us and what shaped us. For example, revolutions are in there. You could pick French Revolution, American Revolution. We've got Chinese dynasties. There's so much to know, but in the end, you just have to pick some things and weave through those connections so teachers can teach across different areas.
Thanks very much.
So I'll contrast that with the experience in the Kimberley, where for the first few years we were just teaching kids to read, getting the words off the page, and doing so at a rate where they could actually understand what they were reading. And of course, spoken language is the foundation for reading. So we then had to work on vocabulary, which is really important, because many of the words the children when then were encountering, they'd never said before or heard before, so they would stumble through them. So we had to start, and we used the writing revolution because of the sentence level work and the fragments versus sentences rolling into paragraphs, but we wove it through with vocabulary. I think you need to look at your context, and it's very big picture in New Zealand. Certainly when I go to the Kimberley, we're not quite at that point. We would put an emphasis on students knowing, because our children often know everything about American culture and lots they don't know about. I had the joy of Dr. Sharon Vaughan, who came to Australia to talk, and she was sitting in a classroom in the middle of nowhere, and she was trying to figure out, and Natalie, I was going to ask you this question, what the big sticks and the little sticks were all about, because there was AFL on the screen. And of course, the kids were very happy to talk to her about that. And they could also talk to her about a lot of American sports as well, which she was quite astounded by because they had an interest. So we have to start at the level of vocabulary. We teach vocabulary explicitly alongside sentence level writing. We give students a reason to write about the vocabulary, otherwise they don't remember. So again, we're pursuing that notion of making it stick. So they need multiple opportunities. Our children don't necessarily read outside of school, so we have to go hard on beginning reading. For many of our kids, though, we've moved beyond that. And when I show videos of the children's writing, people are quite surprised. But it's that structure. And we write every day and we use the vocabulary, and that's kind of where we're at. And then I think that the big piece for me in all of this is you have to look at your context. Who is in front of you? What do they know? What do they bring to the table? It's going to be different when I'm in a classroom in Halls Creek versus a classroom in Canberra. And I have to adjust accordingly. I think that really is the skill of it now as teachers. That's the new demand, to be able to adapt according to who's in front of you.
In Australia, our curriculum has been described as an inkblot test that can mean anything to anyone. What was it that convinced you that New Zealand needed a knowledge-rich curriculum? Because it's not a debate that seems to be happening in Australia at the moment.
Well, I don't have an education background. And when I came to this role, I had to very quickly upskill in opposition. And what made me realise what we needed was, frankly, all of these amazing people. I met Pam Snow and Lorraine Hammond, and I met you and Nathaniel Swain and all of these incredible people. And they have had an enormous impact on me, and I know on other ministers and politicians around the world. So the power of you, Glenn, and the New Zealand Initiative in New Zealand and other groups and other academics around the world is huge. Because many politicians, we end up in roles that we know nothing about. I mean, other than having children and being educated myself, I don't have an education background or any knowledge. So the power of you being able to influence us through evidence and science, cognitive science, research, and actually results is really important. And I think the thing that swung it for me was there were a number of schools in New Zealand who had already embarked on the structured literacy journey. They were doing explicit teaching. They were using a knowledge-rich curriculum. They had led out in front because they had met and done the research. And it was their results that I saw when I was out in the traps in opposition visiting these schools, seeing the results of our Indigenous kids, our Māori kids, who are now reading and excelling at the same rate as every other child for the first time in that school's history. That was the light bulb moment for me. I'm like, we need this in every single school. So it's a mixture of things. So it's sort of been led by the sector, but also hugely influenced by these incredible giants. And that's why I feel like, I'm just a politician. I don't know nearly as much as all these other amazing people, but I'm trying to soak it all up.
And just while we wait for the next question in the audience, maybe the Minister just to maybe just build on that point for us, that what you're talking about and what you're embarking on, this is something that's part of something right across the English-speaking world. It's joining up experts, former policymakers, including our dear friend Senator Gibb. Talk to us a little bit about this is that network that's involved here.
My first entree into this network was when I was at the World Education Forum, and there was a lone person clapping in the corner as I was speaking. Who is this crazy person? Looked across, and there is Sir Nick Gibb clapping me when I'm talking about pushing back against a waffly high-level curriculum that's full of the thoughts on critical thinking and collaboration without any actual knowledge. I was talking about that and pushing back against that. And then meeting Sir Nick and understanding what happened in the UK. And there is an incredible network of people that Sir Nick has introduced me to. And also in New Zealand, we've brought speakers to New Zealand like Natalie and Nita Archer and Emily Hanford and others, and Pam Snow. And so it is a very small world when you start to realise that we are all connected and we're all talking, and I'm watching their podcasts and reading what they're saying, and they are getting them to come to New Zealand, and it's not easy. We just had a curriculum roadshow where I had Sir Nick and Dr. Nathaniel Swain and Natalie Wexler speaking, and for the most part, great. But you had those people going, well, why are these, Americans and English people and Australians coming here? Because we have this view of only good things can come from New Zealand, and we navel gaze so much without actually lifting our eyes up and going, look. The reason I brought Sir Nick was, look what happened in the UK. Our results are equally as in the toilet as they were 15 years ago. And look what happened when they did all of this amazing work. So it is a bit of a battle sometimes, but I think overwhelmingly teachers are on board.
Back to the floor, gentleman over here.
I just want to probe the question around AI and the way it can help with knowledge acquisition. And I think, clearly as adults, most of our learning is self-directed. And so, in school, as well as high quality explicit teaching, we do need to engage children in self-directed learning. So if we kind of accept that, and if we think about the way we learn with AI, not when we're using AI when we already know the answer, but when we're actually learning something entirely new, like trying to understand a health diagnosis or something, we back and forth with AI, we ask it to explain the vocab we don't know, ask it to kind of elaborate on the bits where we don't have the prior knowledge. I just wonder whether there's a real role for AI to help children. You say, look at that baseball example. You go to ChatGPT. Can you just explain that a little bit more for somebody that doesn't know about baseball? And and of course, you would learn, you would get your understanding, your comprehension, but you would also learn about baseball. So I'm keen to hear your thoughts on that notion of AI being a tool for that kind of self-directed knowledge acquisition, in addition to, of course, the explicit teaching that's going to be going on.
I guess that's for me. I mean, I think there is a role for AI in teaching. I'm against this sort of unfettered access to it, because I think that's a slippery slope for kids. But yeah, I mean, there have been studies showing that when you give kids access to AI as a study tool, as an aid to learning, they become over-reliant on it. And so I think, yes, we do need to teach kids how to use AI so that it is a supplement to learning rather than a replacement for learning. And some of the most promising uses of AI for students, I think, have been as using AI more as a tutor. So the AI bot asks you questions, and then depending on your answer would ask you a different question, and sort of guiding you to your own learning rather than just providing you with a text. And actually, this is before AI, but the cricket paragraph that I show, somebody once said to me, oh, why don't you show that? Nobody will understand it, but then you define all the terms and you give them the definitions, and then you show that paragraph to them again and they will understand it. So I spent about 45 minutes Googling all the cricket terms in that paragraph that I did not understand. And maybe AI would have done a better job, but I still didn't understand the paragraph because the definitions were all in terms that I didn't understand. So there's a real limit to what Google or AI can do.
Can I also just jump in there? It's also a question about time, because self-directed learning we have been doing in New Zealand at a very young age, and it is so destructive. Children teaching I still go into schools where the teacher is just the facilitator, and I say, what if the kids don't understand something? Oh, they'll work it out themselves between each other. It's terrible. But the key thing about teaching, especially knowledge, is that back and forth, repetition, recall. We do it today, and then we'll recall it again tomorrow. Now you say the word, you say this word now, and checking for understanding all of the time, constantly. You don't get that with AI. You get maybe when they're older, potentially, but to start with, you need a teacher in the classroom who is read along with me. Now you read it. Now I'll read it. Now we're going to read it together. Now we're going to write the word. Now checking for understanding all of the time. And I'm not a teacher, but I've seen it enough that just embedding it and getting them to repeat the vocabulary, say it out loud. AI does not say the word popping crease, and when we're talking about a cricket or something. So they're not saying it. So they're not retaining it in their long-term memory. And so that's why, and you're the expert, and I feel terrible saying this in front of you, so hopefully I'm right. But especially at those younger ages, that teaching of knowledge and checking for understanding and repetition is so important. And then potentially as they get older, that self-directed learning can come in. But man, it's so destructive when we go straight to AI, self-directed learning straight away. We have to build up knowledge and understanding first.
And a very impressive display of cricket vocabulary, Minister, as well. Yeah, please, Ben.
Maybe a comment in some respects that I think where we're going with this discourse, and I think we have moved the needle and we have stopped spinning the wheels, to use all the metaphors, but I think if the public knew that education academics are actively railing against the teaching of knowledge, there might be riots in the streets. And I think this really needs to be outed. There are Australian education academics who are writing polemics about the crisis of the fact that education policymakers are now finally galvanising around explicit teaching and knowledge-rich curriculum. So the crisis for those people is not that 30% of children are not reading proficiently, not that burden is being borne unreasonably by equity groups. The crisis is that we're doing something about it. And I think that's the public discourse that really needs to take this to the next level, so that education academics have to be publicly accountable on the fact that they essentially are saying, oh, we want kids to succeed, but not that way.
Eloquent as always. Thank you, Pam. That was a very, very powerful message.
I did just want to raise something that I've noticed, and it's more of a comment that I'm curious about the perspective of the panel on, which is that almost in response to the social justice capacity of this literacy and direct instruction and that narrative that's coming from interested parties, that there seems to be a growing middle class response, which is, we don't need this. We want our children to have critical thinking skills, and we want our children to be engaged in future-focused learning, which is really directing a lot of this outsourcing of thinking to AI, relying a lot on these find the main idea thoughts, because they come with a lot of cultural capital already. So I'm just wondering if anyone's thought about that as an emerging idea or concern.
Can I invite Natalie and Lorraine on that one, and I'll give us a final wrap.
So I don't think we've seen that movement, and this sounds like parents, basically. And we're not there in the United States because I think parents are not yet really aware of what's going on with curriculum. I think they trust their teachers, and there hasn't been nearly as much public discussion of knowledge-rich curriculum, cognitive science in the United States. But I do think that parents are often quite pleased when their kids come home very excited to tell them all about the human digestive system or whatever they learned about that day. So, but I have had parents, just casually tell me, schools, they spend too much time on facts, and what we need is, so I think, well, actually, that may be what happens at higher grade levels, because the kids they aren't coming in with the background knowledge. So the teachers, out of desperation, get them to try to memorize a whole bunch of facts. But I guess, the answer, I think, as with educators, is to try to educate parents about the fact that if your child knows a lot about a topic, they will be far better able to think critically about that topic. If they don't know about the topic, or they know very little about it, they're not going to be able to think critically about it. So there's no way of separating these things out and just focusing on the higher order skills. And even with AI, if we could end up in a situation where AI is spitting out things that we can't really understand, and we have to sort of rely on AI to tell us about the world. And I know from experience, AI can make mistakes. One of my education books, I came across an AI summary that said that the reader would learn about the complexities of marriage from my book, which is definitely not one of the topics I cover. So we have to be careful.
It'll be good for book sales, though.
Some years ago, I was talking to a school principal, and I said to him, so if I'm going to work in your school, we need to do these things. And he said, but I don't like explicit instruction. And I said, well, it's not actually for you, Roger. It's for the children, because they can't read and write very well. And I've looked at your NAPLAN data and it's terrible. So if you want me to work in your school, this is what we are going to do. That has lessened to a degree, but there's still that mentality of not here, not in my place. I see a lot of it in some school sectors. One's associated with perhaps high fee paying schools. And I think that it's very alive and well there. I have a project at the moment that takes me into all 3 sectors in one state. So I'm hearing a lot of that. And that is almost something designed to attract parents, I think. However, as a parent myself, I wish my child never had a mobile phone and never had a device, because I'm constantly, and was recently, still, taking games off his device that he would put back on there and take to school. So education likes a shiny thing. Okay, and we've jumped on board with the mobile phones. They'll be great, everyone said. Now we're going, no, they're not great, actually. We'd rather they didn't bring them to school. Same with the devices. And you look at the role of devices when you look at the act of writing and the thought process for writing and the spin-off back to reading through teaching writing. There are so many. So, yeah.
Thanks, everybody, for your company this morning, especially bright and early. We look forward to seeing you again. Please join me in thanking our panel.
For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice, working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.